Jon Resar, Director of the Cardiac Catheterization Laboratory and Interventional Cardiology at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. We're going to be discussing the partners trial, the cohort B trial that was presented presented today at the TCT meeting and released yesterday in the New England Journal of Medicine. So the partners cohort B trial looked at patients with severe aortic stenosis who were deemed inoperable for surgical aortic valve replacement and were randomized to transcatheter aortic valve implantation or medical management. And medical management included aortic valvuloplasty and other medical modalities for the treatment of these patients. So the primary endpoint was mortality at 1 year, and the percutaneous aortic valve placement patients had a mortality in the range of 30% compared to the medically managed patients' mortality of 50%. So there was a highly statistically significant reduction in 1 year mortality in the percutaneous valve treated patients. Well, that's a very difficult question, and we grapple with that on many levels. In fact, earlier this week there was a paper in the New York Times discussing that very topic in reference to treatment of patients with melanoma. There's clearly a need for controlled patients in these trials, but again, as a caregiver, I know that aortic valvuloplasty does not change the natural history of severe aortic stenosis. So it's very difficult for me to randomize patients to the control arm. Again, we have a wealth of data. 15,000 patients worldwide have been treated with percutaneous aortic valves, and we know reasonable short-term and intermediate-term data in these patients. And it's, again, that's something that the FDA has to decide, but it's, as a clinician, very difficult to randomize these patients to medical management. Well, these, again, the mortality at 1 year was 30% in the TAVI treated patients. You need to remember that these are patients who have multiple comorbidities. They're elderly. The average age was 83 years old. And so these patients are deemed inoperable because of their comorbidities. And so I wasn't surprised by the 30% mortality at 1 year. To a large extent, these patients are dying because of their comorbidities. And in the trial, bleeding complications as a result of delivery of the device was also a major predictor of 1 year mortality. So clearly the device needs to be refined with respect to bleeding complications as the device is miniaturized, and hopefully we learn how to deploy this device better in the future. Right, so the stroke rate in the TAVI treated patients was 5% at a year. And that's clearly an issue that needs to be addressed. In fact, if you do diffusion-weighted MR imaging of patients pre and post TAVI, the incidence of new defects on MRI imaging is nearly 80%. It's also nearly 50% in surgically treated patients. So clearly we need to refine this deployment technique. As the device is miniaturized, that'll have an effect. There's discussion of having filter-type devices to the cerebral circulation deployed while the device is implanted. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and hopefully with continued refinement and technology, the major stroke rate will be reduced. Yes, so the access site bleeding was the major source of bleeding in these patients. They're treated with intraprocedural heparin and then aspirin and clopidogrel for 6 months thereafter. But most of the issue pertained to the procedural bleeding. Again, this is a large bore catheter. These patients are elderly. They do have significant atherosclerotic disease in the iliofemoral arterial tree. And so again, the devices are miniaturized as we learn improved techniques for delivering large bore devices through the arterial tree. The bleeding complications will hopefully decrease. But this is also a major predictor of one-year outcomes. And so this is something that has to be addressed in the future. So in the TAVI-treated patients, about 10 to 11% had moderate or severe paravalvular regurgitation at 1 year. Again, this valve, many of these, the aortic annulus that is treated, the architecture that is different from how the valve is deployed. For the majority of these patients, the paravalvular regurgitation is not clinically significant. In a very small minority, it is, and a second valve can be deployed. And I think as these valves are further refined in terms of the annular deployment, that the frequency of valvular regurgitation, paravalvular regurgitation, can be reduced. The valve, at least in the short term and intermediate term, does appear to be durable, and the valvular regurgitation is quite small. With respect to conduction system disease, the Edwards sapien valve does have a very low rate, on the order of 3 to 4%, of pacemaker implantation in the year following valve deployment. And this does seem to be somewhat higher in the core valve deployments based on outside of the U.S. data, primarily European data. So that's something that'll need to be looked at as we launch the core valve trial in the United States.